You're completely useless. A drain. I don't know why I even bother. The words, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone swatting a fly, landed not as a surprise, but as a confirmation. The lukewarm coffee in my mug suddenly felt like ice water. Outside the kitchen window, the familiar suburban street, usually a source of quiet comfort, seemed to blur, the vibrant green of the lawn leaching into a dull, oppressive gray. This wasn't a new sentiment, not really. It was a recurring theme, a low hum beneath the surface of every interaction, a constant reminder of my perceived inadequacy. For years, I'd learned to deflect, to absorb, to pretend the words didn't sting. My mother's voice, sharp and perpetually disappointed, was the soundtrack to my childhood, and now, my adulthood. My father, a man of quiet stoicism, usually retreated behind his newspaper, his silence a tacit acceptance of her pronouncements. It was a fragile piece, built on my swallowed pride and her unyielding judgment. There was the time in high school, after I'd spent months meticulously restoring an old bicycle, a labor of love that consumed my weekends and scraped my knuckles raw. I presented it to her, a gleaming testament to my newfound mechanical skills, hoping for just a flicker of acknowledgement. Instead, she'd looked it over, her lips pursed, and declared, "It's a good thing your brother is already enrolled in that expensive engineering program. What are you going to do with this junk?" The bike, painstakingly resurrected from a rusty heap, had immediately felt like landfill fodder. Or the time I'd worked 2 jobs to save for a down payment on a small apartment, a tangible step towards independence. The moment I'd shown her the signed lease, she'd barely looked up from her gardening. "You know, if you had just stayed home, you wouldn't have to worry about rent. Your father and I could have helped you with something much bigger, something." The implication, as always, was that my efforts were misguided, my ambitions small, and my very existence a burden that they, generously, tolerated. These instances, and countless others, were not dramatic confrontations. They were quiet dismissals, insidious underminings that chipped away at my self-worth, leaving me feeling perpetually adrift in their sea of unspoken expectations. The air in the living room had been thick with the scent of lemon polish and unspoken tension. Sunlight, usually a cheerful intruder, felt harsh, illuminating dust motes dancing in the oppressive stillness. My mother sat on the floral sofa, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. My father was in his usual armchair, a book open but unread on his lap. The conversation had started innocuously enough, a discussion about a potential investment opportunity my father had been exploring. It was a modest sum, a few $1,000s he was considering putting into a friend's small business. Then, my mother's tone shifted, her voice hardening. "It's not worth the risk, Harold. We need that money. For our retirement. For emergencies." My father, usually placid, had sighed, a sound of weariness. "It's just a small amount, dear. A hedge." And then, her gaze had swiveled to me, perched on the edge of the armchair opposite her, my own small savings account, painstakingly built over years of careful budgeting and side hustles, a source of quiet pride. "Unlike people," she drawled, the words dripping with a familiar condescension, "we actually money saved. And we're not throwing it away on frivolous things." I'd felt a prickle of defiance, a sensation I'd learned to suppress. But today, something felt different. The constant barrage of criticism, the implied worthlessness, had finally coalesced into a solid block of resentment. "Actually," I'd said, my voice surprisingly steady, "that frivolous thing you seem to be referring to is the $10,000 I lent you 3 years ago. The money I specifically set aside for a down payment on a house." The room fell silent. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, usually a comforting rhythm, became a deafening thud. My mother's eyes widened, her carefully constructed composure cracking. My father's head snapped up, his expression a mixture of surprise and dawning realization. He looked at me, then at her, then back at me, his brow furrowed. $10,000, he repeated, his voice low and disbelieving. My mother, recovering her composure with alarming speed, scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. That's not true." Her voice, however, lacked its usual conviction. "It is," I said, my gaze locked on hers. "You needed it for that boutique you wanted to open." You promised you'd pay me back as soon as the first profits came in. Which, as I recall, never happened. The boutique, a fleeting entrepreneurial dream that had evaporated as quickly as it appeared, had been funded not by her own capital, but by my savings, a fact she had conveniently erased from their shared narrative. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. My father looked at her, his silence now a heavy accusation. The following days were a masterclass in passive aggression. My mother, refusing to acknowledge the truth of my statement, resorted to even more pointed digs about my financial irresponsibility and general lack of ambition. Text messages would arrive, ostensibly from her, forwarded through my father, lamenting my lack of judgment and unrealistic expectations. My father, however, was different. The spark of indignation I'd seen in his eyes had ignited into a quiet, simmering anger. He started asking me more questions, not about the loan, but about my life, my work, my plans. He listened, truly listened, for the first time in years. Then came the email. It wasn't from my mother. It was from my father. A short, direct message. Subject, documentation. Attached were scanned copies of several documents, my original savings account statements from the relevant period, detailing the withdrawal of the $10,000. Alongside them were copies of checks made out to my mother, with the memo line clearly stating loan, boutique investment. And then, the most damning piece of evidence, a handwritten promissory note, signed by my mother, acknowledging the loan and promising repayment within 6 months. The note, a relic of her initial desperation, had been tucked away in a drawer, forgotten. My father, it seemed, had been conducting his own quiet investigation. He'd clearly confronted her, and her denial had only fueled his need for proof. The next time I saw them, the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. My mother was visibly shaken, her usual bluster replaced by a defensive, almost fearful, demeanor. My father, however, was calm. He didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice. He simply sat, his gaze steady, a silent observer of the fallout. When my mother attempted to brush aside the topic with a dismissive wave of her hand, my father interrupted her, his voice measured but firm. We need to discuss this, Eleanor. Properly. The look on her face, the dawning realization that her carefully constructed facade had crumbled, was a slow, agonizing unraveling. It was not the triumphant moment of yelling or confrontation, but the quiet, almost imperceptible shift of power, the moment the rug was pulled out from under her. The aftermath was a symphony of frantic texts and desperate phone calls. My mother, stripped of her authority, turned into a whirlwind of accusations, her narrative shifting to portray herself as the victim, me as the ungrateful, manipulative child. She enlisted her sisters, my aunts, as her flying monkeys, their calls filled with thinly veiled judgments and inquiries about my current financial situation. They'd always been quick to take her side, their loyalty unwavering, fueled by years of shared family gossip and her skillful manipulation. My father, however, remained a silent anchor of truth. He didn't engage with the flying monkeys. He simply stated facts, providing the documentation to anyone who questioned him. The social consequences for my mother were swift and brutal. Her carefully cultivated image of the generous matriarch, the pillar of the community, began to crumble. Whispers turned into open speculation. The boutique, her failed business venture, resurfaced as a cautionary tale. Her entitlement, once a source of irritation, was now viewed through a lens of ruthless deceit. She had, in essence, stolen from her own child, and her husband had the irrefutable proof. The $10,000, a sum I had worked incredibly hard for, a symbol of my independence and resourcefulness, had become the catalyst for her downfall. Her reputation, her carefully constructed identity, was in tatters. The silence that followed, after the initial storm of recriminations, was profound. There were no more casual insults, no more veiled criticisms. Her gaze, when it met mine, was often filled with a mixture of resentment and a grudging respect. She had underestimated me, had dismissed me as useless, and in doing so, had set in motion her own undoing. The satisfaction wasn't in her ruin, but in the quiet restoration of my own truth. It was the knowledge that I had been seen, validated, and that the scales, however slowly, had finally tipped towards justice. The quiet revenge was not in inflicting pain, but in the undeniable exposure of her character, a truth that would echo in the silence long after the shouting had faded.